So let's talk about a really pivotal moment in history, that exact point when the United States jumped from being a nation focused on its own continent to one with its eyes on the entire globe. We're going to break down how the US transformed into a world power right at the turn of the 20th century.
Okay, so look at this. This right here, this is basically our roadmap for the whole story. It lays everything out in 3 acts. The ideas that got things started, the big turning point, and then the boom in global power. Let's walk through it step by step to really see how this massive change happened.
All right, let's rewind the clock a bit, back to the late 1800s. For about 100 years, America had really been focused inward, expanding across North America. But once that chapter closed, a new question started popping up.
I mean, think about it. After you've expanded all the way to the Pacific Ocean, what do you do next? For a lot of influential American leaders, the answer was pretty obvious. You start looking outward, beyond your own borders. A brand new and pretty controversial idea was starting to take hold.
And that new idea, it has a name: imperialism. Now, yeah, that's a pretty loaded term, but let's just break down the basic definition. It's simply a policy where a strong nation extends its control or influence over other territories. And for a growing America, this seemed to many like the logical next step.
Okay, but why? What was really pushing this big change? Well, it pretty much boils down to 3 main things. First, you've got economics. American factories were making way more stuff than people at home could buy, so they needed new places to sell their goods. Second, to protect all that new trade, they needed naval bases scattered around the world. And third, well, having those bases would naturally build up a much stronger military presence on the world stage.
And this quote from a naval strategist named Alfred T. Mahan, it just perfectly captures the thinking at the time. His whole argument, which was super persuasive, was that if you look at history, the greatest nations were the ones with the strongest navies. It all connected, you see. To sell your stuff abroad, you needed ships. To protect those ships, you needed a great navy. And for that navy to go anywhere, it needed bases all over the globe. This one idea, man, it really lit a fire under the people who wanted to expand.
All right, so we've got the theory. Now let's talk about the event that put it all into practice, the Spanish-American War. This was a short, really dramatic conflict that acted as the catalyst, the thing that officially launched America as a major world player.
So how did this whole thing kick off? It was like a domino effect, one thing happening right after another. First, people in the US started hearing these awful stories about how Spain was treating the people in Cuba. Then, the newspapers, using what was called yellow journalism, blew these stories up to sell more papers. Next, a private letter from a Spanish diplomat that insulted the US president got leaked. And then came the final spark. The American battleship, the USS Maine, mysteriously blew up in Havana Harbor.
And that led to this rallying cry you heard everywhere. Remember the Maine. To hell with Spain. The newspapers just ran with it, and the American public became convinced that Spain was behind the explosion. The pressure on the government to declare war became just immense, and it didn't take long for that to happen.
What's fascinating is when you look at who was fighting who. On one side, you have the United States, a young, booming industrial country with a new, modern navy. And on the other side, you have Spain, once a massive empire, but now kind of a shadow of its former self. So the result was almost a given. The whole war was over in just a few months.
And the results of this short war? Wow, they were absolutely huge. In the peace treaty, Spain hands over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. Cuba gets its independence, but with a catch. The Platt Amendment gave the U.S. the right to step in whenever it wanted, which basically made Cuba a U.S. protectorate. And bam, just like that, America has an overseas empire.
Okay, so now America has all this new territory, a ton of confidence, and we're stepping into the 20th century ready to really act like a world power. Let's see what that looked like.
First stop, Asia. Now that it had the Philippines as a base, the US was really interested in the huge market in China. To stop other countries from just carving up China for themselves, the US basically said, hey, hold on, we want in on this too. So they pushed for what they called an open door policy, which just meant that everyone should have equal access to trade there. It was a classic move, using new power to protect its own economic interests.
Meanwhile, back in its own neighborhood, you've got President Teddy Roosevelt. His whole philosophy was famously, speak softly and carry a big stick. Basically, try diplomacy first, but make sure everyone knows you've got a powerful military to back you up. And this idea led to something called the Roosevelt Corollary. It was an update to the old Monroe Doctrine, and it basically announced to the world that the U.S. was now the policeman of the Western Hemisphere.
But maybe the biggest, most game-changing project of them all was the Panama Canal. And listen, this was way more than just a shortcut for cargo ships. For the military, it was an absolute game-changer. By cutting right through Central America, it meant the U.S. Navy could zip between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This move effectively doubled its naval power and let it project that power anywhere in the world.
So, let's zoom out. You add all this up, and by the early 1900s, the picture is pretty clear. The U.S. is the big boss in the Caribbean, it's the main power broker in Latin America, and it's a brand new major force across the Pacific Ocean.
And all of that brings us to our final takeaway. I mean, this was one of the quickest and most important transformations you'll see in modern history.
So here's the bottom line. In just a handful of years, driven by new ideas about naval power, kicked off by a quick and decisive war, and sealed by some really bold foreign policy, the United States went from being a nation focused on its own continent to a true global power with influence stretching all across the planet.
And that really leaves us with a big question to think about, right? This huge shift over 100 years ago completely redrew the map of the world and set the stage for the century to come. So the question for us today is, what is the legacy of that power? And how does it still shape the world we live in right now?